Charles Waits.
Well, Ben will say the same thing that you have just said. I apologize to the people that haven't been fed yet, and to those that have to go on eating over what I am saying. And would say in the beginning that I have congratulated both congressmen since they have simplified my speech, and indeed you could even do away with this part of the program by just encapsulating both the general message that you got first and the specific one that you got second, and you would have a very good idea of the main line that I want to talk to you about. So I'll skip over some of the introduction that I wanted to give and try and get to the basic issue immediately, because I know you are short of time and I know you want to get on with your program, and I am deeply appreciative of this opportunity to be here. I do know the background of the Farmers Union and its UN devotion, and I wish you were duplicated in every state in the Union and by many, many organizations, because I think the work you do is of fundamental importance. But you asked me to talk about the United Nations, its present situation, and its future prospects. And so, leaving aside FAO, agriculture, and the specific concerns which are yours, I would like to talk about the UN, and from the standpoint of politics, international politics. I think we start by saying that there is no doubt that the UN is in crisis, that its role in peacemaking seems virtually non-existent, and that its usefulness as a forum for reconciling international questions and for designing programs to harmonize international actions for the benefit of all people is, while still intact, tarnished by financial uncertainties for its future, by the near bankruptcy of the organization today, and by the tendency of the powers, particularly the superpowers, to meet in small groups or blocks and to arrange their affairs together outside of the UN. No matter how far-reaching new programs are, ideas such as have just come out of the Stockholm Conference on the Environment, or the UN programs for population control or drug control, nonetheless, there are limits to which these programs can go or can be effectively administered if the basic political functions of the United Nations are neglected or wither away. Without effective peacemaking and peacekeeping, we cannot expect the public to respect and support the UN, and without this, it will lack the institutional vitality to discharge the non-political functions. Even more obviously, I think, global cooperation in the economic and the social spheres will not endure in a world of disorder, lawlessness, violence, or disregard of the rights of people or nations large or small. But I think we shouldn't just dismiss the UN as a failure. I think we have a lot of very valuable programs. Just keep in mind such things, and I'm sure you've heard them at previous meetings. The emergency force, the operation in the Congo, during which Dag Hammarskjöld gave his life, the UN Special Fund, which is now a $200 million a year program to help the developing nations improve their economies and the lives of their people. There was President Eisenhower's Atoms for Peace, which is now called the International Atomic Energy Agency. There are such things as the UN FAO World Food Program, which uses food for economic development projects and for mother and child nutrition programs and for emergency assistance. There is the Weather Watch, and there is the UN Fund for Population Control, and so on and so forth. A lot of very important programs. And most of the ones that I have just mentioned, and there are many others, have in fact come because of past initiatives of this government. Over the past 4 administrations, most of these new programs have been moved into the international community. So it is an institution that has had, and still possesses in many ways, a great deal of viability. Today, also, I think we should keep in mind that a lot of historical things of very great importance are taking place in the world. I don't think any of us could have predicted even a few years ago President Nixon's journey to China, or mainland China's entry into the UN, or the great détente which sends congressional leaders and all kinds of people rushing to Peking, the opening of trade relations, the sale of wheat and other things. I don't think we could have anticipated that commutation between Moscow and Washington would be like traveling back and forth between San Francisco and Washington and New York is like San Francisco and New York, and that we never know whether Kissinger is going to be in Moscow or in Washington, or that whether Andrei Gromyko is going to spend the night at Camp David or not. That sounds a little funny when we remember Mr. Khrushchev's shoe on the table at the UN and his threat to bury the United States. Berlin is an open city. East and West Germany are in direct contact with each other. The two Koreas are seeking ways to bring the families separated by the war back together again. The Federal Republic of Germany and Poland have reached an agreement. India and Pakistan have their Simla agreement. All this is really quite improbable if looked at from 2 or 3 years ago. The polemical age seems to be giving way to a strange urge for conciliation, and except for the continued horror of Vietnam and the deadlock in the Middle East, there are talks going on. But, in every single case that I have mentioned, this has happened outside the United Nations. And here, ladies and gentlemen, is the root cause of the problem. And a real problem that it is. The area of peacemaking and peacekeeping is the great undeveloped area of the United Nations Charter. Nations are simply not using the UN, and I quote, to bring about, by peaceful means and in conformity with the principles of justice and international law, adjustment or settlement of international disputes or situations which might lead to a breach of peace. I think there is no question that we should be under any illusion that merely having the institution of the United Nations will suffice. What is needed is a political will to use the institution and the political will to make the institution work. What appears to be happening today is that states, and in particular the large and the super-large states, are moving toward a multipolar approach to international affairs, resting on a balance of power concept. And since a number of the mini-powers are closely bound to the super-states, their unwillingness to compromise or to negotiate or to arbitrate reflects the superpower approach and not their own. You can be relatively certain that very little of the present world intransigence between the non-superpowers or even the small wars that we witness would continue if the superpowers stopped arming the mini-states. We must be very careful to ensure that we are not today living with a chimera, an illusion in which power and law become confused, and that we mistake political power for the rule of law. In life, law and power operate together. We must not dream of a utopia in which a few superstates will use their power to settle the affairs of the world. The superpowers of an earlier day tried that in the period after the Congress of Vienna. When this concert broke apart, world war ensued, and the order established by the 19th century giants did not redress any of the grievances, but merely suppressed them or held them in check. And keep in mind that the balance of power of the Congress of Vienna was limited to 60 million people and was European. Today, the world is 3.7 billion people, 140 nations, and the weapons are hydrogen bombs delivered by rockets half a world away which can wipe out whole cities, not just puny cannon. So let's be careful before we accept this thesis that the superpower arrangement is the way to peace. But to return, the UN is in trouble, even serious trouble, and part of that trouble is because of the actions or the lack of actions of the government of the United States. There is no point in trying to hide this fact, nor to gloss over it. Nor is there any reason to dodge the point that the United Nations cannot succeed without the United States. It could perhaps continue to exist as an institution, but it would not be an effective instrument of international cooperation. And it won't assist us either if we try to make a catalog here of all the things that have happened or not happened in these last years. But we must recognize that the U.S. attitude, the will of the United States to make the UN work, is crucial, and that on the basis of all the evidence that we have, the U.S. people do not want to watch and certainly don't want to be responsible for the decline and fall of the United Nations. Many Americans and others have misgivings about how the UN is doing its job, but so near as we can tell, the majority would like to see the UN become a stronger institution rather than the weak one which it now is. The Secretary General, the new Secretary General, in his introduction to the work of the organization, said just a few weeks ago in the report that was issued the following, and I'd like to quote his words. Despite the shortcomings and despite the current popular tendency in some parts of the world to downgrade the United Nations, the organization still remains the best long-term basis on which the international community as a whole can opt for survival, justice, and progress with the participation of all nations. In the long run, there is no substitute for such an instrumentality. The problem is how to make it work in the political realities of today. The member states alone can develop the potential of the organization by using it and obeying its rules, by holding to the long-term objectives of the Charter in spite of the short-term disappointments and frustrations, and by accepting the imperfections and shortcomings of the United Nations not as a mark of failure, but as a part of the inevitable process of growth which any institution must pass through in its early stages of development. Thus, I think, Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, that you can only find the answers about the future of the United Nations, the future prospects which you ask me to explore, by answering for yourselves, as citizens of the most critical member state of the UN, what political will you are prepared to exercise to make the institutional arrangements work. Are you prepared to accept its failures as yours and resolve to turn the failures to successes, not alone for yourselves, but for hundreds of millions of fellow people throughout the world? Personally, my own assessment is that the prospects are bright, despite the present slough of despond in which the UN seems to be. And I'd like to tell you why I think this is so. First, because the number of actors on the world stage has increased so dramatically. When, just before the end of World War II, there was an inquiry among the great powers as to the maximum size the UN might become, the largest guess was that there would be about 85 members. This estimate so horrified one or two of the big powers, who realized that the only way this number could be reached was by the loss of its colonies, that the results of the inquiry were suppressed and never made public. So the majority of the states which are now members of the United Nations were not even independent countries at the time the UN Charter was signed in 1945. And these are sovereign and equal, even though we know that their population, their economic ability, and their social development vary widely. But their interests and their concerns also vary widely. Second, nuclear deterrence will and is becoming a less and less useful mechanism to preserve world order. Second strike capacity may restrain a superpower, but it has little influence on the non-nuclear powers. They recognize that the superpowers do not use their weapons against each other, nor against any other nation. Nor will a nation resort to nuclear power when it must estimate at least 1/3 of its people dead, 2/5 to 1/2 of its industrial capacity laid waste, and potentially a blanket of radioactivity covering the world, enfeebling life, poisoning land and water, and biologically twisting future generations. Third, the global threats to life are enlarging. Exploding populations drain the world's Earth's available resources and contribute to the deterioration of the environment. Pollution of the sea and the air know no national boundaries. And since the finiteness of the Earth's resources places limits on its life support capabilities, threats can only be dealt with on a global basis. Fourth, the gap between the rich and the poor nations is expanding. All efforts over the past 2 decades have failed to halt this movement, and within the poor countries themselves, the rich get richer while the poor stay poor or become poorer by comparison. No less a person than Robert McNamara, the president of the World Bank Group, said before his Board of Governors just a few days ago that the affluent nations are not moving effectively enough to assist the indigent nations. He said they must act both through trade and aid to diminish the widening imbalance, or that world development cannot succeed within any acceptable time frame. The community of nations, he predicted, will become more dangerously fragmented, with the privileged, self-satisfied, complacent on one side, and the deprived, frustrated, and bitter on the other. And this will not be an international atmosphere conducive to tranquility. Fifth, international interdependence of nations are growing. All nations are increasingly dependent upon complex networks of trade, commerce, and communication, and the world increasingly constitutes a single economic system whose whole health or whole illness must be assessed together. And finally, new power centers are rising and rising rapidly. Japan, the European Economic Community, the People's Republic of China. While the middle powers exert an even greater influence, and with the shifts in military calculation that I mentioned just a moment ago, both the political and the moral force of the developing nations, as they concur and work together, are going to have greater and greater effect on the superpowers. Then can we look for just a minute at what things can be done here to reverse the present drift away from the UN into a situation of strengthening it, if out of recognition for nothing more than the fact that we together live in a global village, and that poverty and hunger and disease in any part of it affects, afflicts, or holds back the whole of it. Let's rule out charter revision. That's a very popular thing to talk about. In the first place, there is no climate of world opinion today on what changes, if any, ought to be agreed upon in the Charter of the UN. The changes that are needed can be achieved by using the Charter as it now is, that is, by changes in the policy of nations. I suppose, Mr. President, that above all other things we must check the arms race. The SALT agreements are encouraging, but there is little likelihood that any real or lasting progress can be made toward achieving UN Charter objectives so long as the powers, super, major, and mini, devote such a large proportion of their national budgets to armaments and such a major proportions of their science, technology, industrial capacity, educational facilities, research to the design, to the manufacture, and to the servicing of means of mass destruction. Can we really expect either peace or tranquility, or genuine efforts to alleviate poverty, disease, hunger, and ignorance at home or throughout the world, with nations spending well over $200 billion annually on arms? Contrast this with the total cost of the entire United Nations establishment, all the specialized agencies, all the development programs, which is just over $1 billion a year. And the United States share of this cost is approximately the same amount as it takes to keep the fire department of the city of New York going. Second, in the political, the economic, and the diplomatic arenas, the United States must reverse its trend away from the United Nations and increase the use of the machinery of the organization. With its great position of leadership and its economic power, it is not only an act of practicality, but it is a moral act of great significance. Where the U.S. ignores the UN, bypasses it, or downgrades its capacities, it effectively is destroying it. Third, the U.S. must move to help the current financial problem at the UN. However this may have arisen, it amounts to a very small amount, but the deficit and the crisis operations which follow leave the United Nations administration and the staff insecure, unable to plan, and necessarily devoting a great deal of time. You may have seen it in the paper today. They're not sure they can meet the November payroll with the cash which is now in hand. Fourth, we must press for the creation of a viable ocean organization, part of or associated with the UN. Let us, for heaven's sakes, not start a new 20th century colonialism to carve up the oceans and the seabeds into zones of national protection or exploitation. A global ocean regime would preserve the freedom of the seas and conserve and develop its resources as a common heritage of man, and the exploitation of its bed under international criteria and standards could be for the welfare of all men. Fifth, let us move from the excellent start that the Stockholm Conference on the Human Environment made to an effective United Nations organization for the environment. We know that the pollution of the atmosphere and the water and the earth are rarely local affairs. So let us start by constructing programs and arranging machinery and establishing the financial means on an international basis commensurate with the scale and the complexities of the problem. Sixth, let's put the UN in the peacekeeping business, assuming that peacemaking is assured. There are many problems here, and we haven't time to go into them, about conditions and rights and obligations, but none of these points are fundamental, and all of them can be resolved provided that you recognize the advantages that are to be derived from multilateral peacekeeping compared to the various bilateral efforts, the costly effects of which we see on every hand today. Seventh, in the expansion of the UN system, let's pay particular attention to the economic sphere, to the aid to developing nations, which needs to be put on a humanitarian and not on a Cold War basis. The expansion of world health, of world food production, of education and economic well-being has nothing to do with a person's political ideology, with his religious beliefs, or with his color. A program built on such short-range considerations is not only doomed to failure, but won't last very long either, because countries do change their political ideology. I think you only have to think for a few minutes about our relations with Chile and what has happened to that in the last couple of years, or our relations with China, for that matter, in order to see the problems of short-range policies. Finally, a substantially new effort must be made to get better public understanding of the United Nations, what it is, what it isn't, and what it can do and what its limitations are. By neglect, by default, we seem, at least in the rich and the well-educated countries, to have drifted into a mood of apathy or even downright cynicism about the United Nations. The media, bless them, highlight the sensational, the deadlock, the stalemate, the veto, but rarely talk very much about the silent army, the economic and social work of the UN. They rarely praise the International Civil Aviation Organization for keeping up a system of international rules and regulations and safety devices and air communication systems to fly airplanes, which, generally speaking, makes it as safe for you to fly on one international airline as another. But let the ICAO conference fail to agree on a system for limiting international hijacking, and it becomes the world's greatest news story. So we must, in schools and clubs and businesses, reappraise the UN and educate ourselves again to its possibilities and to a belief in peaceful coexistence and cooperation between nations. The aim, perfectly obviously, Mr. President, and I'm coming to the end, is not world government. Let's not engage in slogan thinking, even if the present undervaluation, underutilization, and drift away from the United Nations can be stopped and reversed. The best that we can achieve in my lifetime will be a loose association of sovereign states. But as nations create better habits of collective action and closer cooperation, the UN could evolve toward a more integrated world, a global federation perhaps. Our federation, the United States of America, has grown and prospered for nearly 200 years, despite its great diversities in size, Rhode Island, for example, and Texas, or population like Nevada and California, or its great differences in religious background or climatic differences or many other things. At the present time, the European community, the USSR, China, Brazil, India, other vast nations of immense internal diversity are busy working out a common destiny. So what may sound utopian or an idealist dream today is really tomorrow's practical reality. Our national heritage, the national heritage of this country, is premised on equality and dignity of all men. The way to peace is to extend that vision to the international sphere. The United Nations cannot assure peace, but there can be no peace without it. So it is your will and the will of this nation that should operate to this end. And I thank you very much for inviting me and for the possibility of being here. Thank you, sir.